Hi, buddy. Welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name is Ky Sinclair and my co-host Mark Palavestra.
Hi, John. Today we've got Alexander Corne, who is a media and PR expert in the automotive space, but also in PR and journalism in general. Now, Alexander covers off some amazing information and really good, valuable information on how to construct a good PR strategy, leveraging things like heritage, technology, and having an authentic and real story to tell, and one that's engaging and distinctive. He also talks about the need to have a war plan that you actually test for if there is a bad PR story that you need to deal with. And having a one voice across the business. He talks about social media and the real benefits that you've got without having a filter on the information that you can share from a PR perspective about yourself and your business. And he talks about the influencers and how to have a structured approach when engaging influencers with your business. So really good information that he covers off and a really riveting interview. John.
Yeah, Mark, definitely a very important topic. And what he really emphasized was that the importance to have a structure and a plan, and everybody needs to know where they stand as part of that plan. And by doing that, the amount of value it can bring to the business, and especially tier 2 businesses that sometimes maybe don't see the importance of it or think it only happens at the OEM part of the business. So really great. Let's jump into it.
Just a quick word from our sponsor before we get into the show.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you along. The questions made sense?
Yeah, look, the questions were good, very good in fact. The only one that I've really not got an answer to is where does fake news fit in all this? I'm not really sure there's that much fake news floating around the car industry, but if you've got some examples of fake news, then yeah, we can sort of talk around them, I suppose.
I suppose the question is, car industry is one bit, but from a PR perspective, the storytelling and the art of storytelling, because where we're keen to take today is early on in our portfolio of podcasts that we've done, we had a marketing expert in who said there's paid, owned and earned. And when you look at paying for marketing, it's quite standard. You go to an agency, you pay a lot of money. They go buy digital media, they buy outdoor, they buy electronic media, TV, radio and the like as the channels for paid marketing. But where he highlighted, a lot of people and businesses overlook the PR side of it, which is the earned marketing, which when we were at Renault, I looked at what you did with our PR team and I felt, and I think the data even spoke to that the brand over-indexed the industry for share of voice. And that PR went a long way with what you did with engaging in not just the journalists, but the storytelling in general was so good that it really accelerated the brand's rise on the back of all the other things that we were doing through the other channels, like what we did in the fleet channel, what we did with dealers and engaging the network and retail campaigns and the like. But the one area that really had, I think, the best return on investment, and I'm not blowing smoke up your proverbial, is what you did in a really powerful storytelling strategy. And I've seen you do it with other businesses as well. And that's why when the opportunity came up to talk to you about that in this podcast, I thought was fantastic. When you actually accepted the invitation, I thought, wow, we need to hear. And because I've been watching you and following on LinkedIn with the things that you're doing as well and the storytelling, it really fitted into what our marketing guru that we had in episode 2, I think it was, John, episode 3, told us about this whole idea of earned. And it's not just for OEMs, it's for what dealers or anyone associated with the industry, whether they're a third-party supplier, there still is a need to look at your overall business plan and your marketing strategy and look at what is that PR story and how do you manage it? Because the same thing happens when, we've all been at brands where we've had bad things happen or some negative press. How do you handle that negative press? And that's why we're really appreciative of you coming in today so we can talk about these sorts of things.
I'm very honoured to be here and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I think what you said at the very beginning about marketing, I think PR has moved into that same type of space as well. Certainly in auto now, you can have paid PR. Obviously, you have earned, and you can have your own. You can own your PR because the channels have been created over the last few years. And I really don't think that too many of the brands are doing a particularly good job with their owned. The paid for stuff is kind of a abrogation of the PR's responsibility by giving it out to the media themselves, by paying for what I would term as a PR or journalistic purist cash for comment. There are many more channels now for earned exposure, but a good PR person would, leverage all of the assets at their disposal to try and get the best result. The landscape has changed quite fundamentally, and like your previous interviewees have said, the business of selling cars in total has changed over the last 10, 20 years. So there's a lot of change, and as somebody in that business, you have to stay on top of all those different elements.
Alex, also from our side, thanks very much for joining us. Great to have you on the show. We've been really excited to listen to you. We crossed paths slightly at Renault, but I didn't have opportunity to deal with you at that time. But maybe stepping back from what Mark said, can you maybe just give us a bit of introduction to PR and sort of maybe what is storytelling and how do you approach that?
Okay, well, I think fundamentally what you're trying to do with storytelling in PR is take people on a journey and invite them to join you on the brand journey. And you need to turn what's new about your business into news and come up with some interesting hooks for grasping the imagination. It's also very important to be authentic in the storytelling so that the messaging that you're putting out there is understood and absorbed and is real, because at the time where the recipient of the storytelling actually comes into direct contact with the brand or the product or whatever, it has to live up to the story. Storytelling is a very creative experience, and it's incredibly fulfilling for the creative people who do it, and they need to be able to convey that level of excitement about the brand or the product through what they do. And I think one of the fundamentals of storytelling is creating the desire and excitement about the brand or the product, and also pointing out what the fundamental benefits or differences or what's the distinctiveness of the product that they're talking. In many cases, corporates have many assets at their disposal. They've either got product or they've got locations, they've got events that they can hook into, and the best assets that many corporates have are the people who work for them. So by sort of moulding and leveraging what exists naturally in the business, you're able to pick out all the cherries, tell a story, create a story that makes sense to the people who are reading it or viewing it, whatever. I think heritage has been in the past quite a strong element, but we've seen the rise of new brands over the last 15 or 20 years that have been created out of nothing, and they have made an impact in the market. So heritage is one of those nice to haves, but I think a good, strong story regarding either technology or advanced technology, they're the key currencies that you'd need for telling a story today.
Okay. Now, Alex, a question for me is, what makes a good PR strategy?
Okay, so I think with strategy, it's like with any other part of the business. You need to have a process, you need to have a focus, you need to have an end goal, and accountability as well. But with PR, because it's such a competitive environment, a bit like, I suppose, marketing or sales, you need to think creatively, you need to think outside the square. You also need to think strategically and tactically with a strategy. Are you building the brand, or are you building the launch of a new product? And that does make a difference. Obviously, the two can coexist side by side. Often there's pressure on PR to act in a very tactical sense, but I think probably working in a more strategic sense gets a better return on investment for the PR professional. Strategy is very important as a sort of a building block within the business to show that you have a number of steps that you're going to be taking to get to a place.
So Alex, you have your strategy, and then you go then into the elements of your PR plan. What makes a good PR plan?
I think the fundamental thing is knowing what you want to say and working out how you're going to say it, and not being distracted off by irrelevant issues. I think being realistic in what you hope to achieve is very important, and having access to the right resources to deploy the strategy. You're not going to be able to launch a whole new brand with the budget for a small range update or something like that. So you've got to understand the resources are pretty key. And then when you get down into the sort of the nitty-gritty, sometimes you can get away with just having a meeting with the media at a location and having a nice little chat and some dinner. Other times you may want to employ more of a challenge or a quest or a stunt, something like that, to capture attention. And it all obviously depends to a large degree what you're planning to promote. I mentioned heritage before. I think heritage and legacy and your people are very important elements of the game plan, and having a very strong and focused series of messages that you want to get across, so that the time that's spent with the media is used to its best effort and best effect, to make sure that everybody who is within the corporate group interacting with the media understands what the key messages are to get across. Because all of the media, each of them has a different objective. They all want to be able to tell a slightly different story. Sometimes they're more interested in what you're not talking about, and one of the key elements, I think, of any PR strategy is to stick to the agreed messaging, so that you don't end up at the end of the day with a lot of articles talking about things that aren't pushing the main story.
Now, Alexander, I recall a number of events that I was involved with yourself at another brand, and it was they were very, very successful. So, and just further to that point, and which is going to lead into my next question, I recall just that discipline that you brought to the business, where you had all of the senior stakeholders in one room, from managing director to the various direct sales directors, after sales directors, marketing directors, and other key PR staff, that all of us had to be on point. And I really thought it was amazing how you would actually look to each one of us and say, right, and you'd go through the list of the journalists that would be in the meeting and say, right, this person's going to go with this skew and this person's got that slant. So how do we deal with that? And they're going to come after you, this person, a person X, director X, because they'll want to know about, say, an after sales issue, or they'll want to focus on director Y, like you, the sales guy, because of what's the actual sales volume that you want to actually, you don't want to put a number out there, because that's the sort of thing that brands don't want to be put out and then have to explain when the number didn't get there. So just that discipline and structure of, okay, or if someone's new to the business, well, they're going to want to know more about their past employer than their new employer. So all of these strong disciplines, so that everyone is on point and the message is the product that you're there to discuss. Because so often we see in a lot of articles in the media, in the automotive space, where a question or a subject about, say, a brand's longevity in Australia will be the takeaway story, yet poor brand's launching a new car, but all the questions around, well, are you going to stay or are you going to go?
Well, I mean, that's what one of the fundamental parts of the role is, to understand what is the media going to be wanting to know, and to be able to redirect that questioning back on track to keep it aligned with the core messaging is critical. As you say, in that example where, there might be questions over fundamental issues regarding a brand, that can do far more damage to the business, to the confidence of the sales channel for instance, than the positive messaging you get out of a review of the new product. And, if you don't have confidence, or if there isn't confidence in the longevity of the business, then you're never going to make any sales anyway. So, but to come back to your point about the briefing, I think making sure that everybody is on message and is disciplined enough to stay on track is critical. And I never thought there was any difficulty or any problem with over preparing executives or staff prior to interviews, because the more confident everybody feels about understanding where we're going and what we're talking about, the easier it's going to be to answer the questions.
So, just for the audience, what's the best way to get the story out into the traditional media space?
Well, I think again, fundamentally, is knowing that for the PR person to know the media audience very intimately, and to understand their outlets and what triggers their interest, and then to formulate the story as much as possible to meet those criteria. So if you've got a specialist magazine, they're going to want to know nitty-gritty bits of information. If it's a more generalist publication, such as a newspaper, price and specifications going to be, and availability are going to be the key criteria. So shaping the message to meet the needs of the audience is very important, and also understanding the formats and also the deadlines that each of the different media have. Now, back in the old days, when there were carburetors and things like that, the vast majority of the media was printed, and there were generally quite long deadlines. So the motoring guy had a weekly column in the paper, and so he had plenty of time to write a story. Now, with the advent of the internet, pretty much as the executives are giving the spiel, the internet journalists are typing away on their phones, and the message is going straight onto the internet immediately. Problem with that is that there's never any time for consideration or even for editing. And so you end up with a message that can be a little bit skewed or confused. And I don't think the audience really cares if you've got a story out there 5 minutes before another website. But if in your haste to get the story out there, as a journalist, you're not considering the full implications of the story and just churning out the verbatim, I'm not sure that really helps your audience, because there are very few people who are sitting on edge at their desk, looking at their computer screen, waiting for this news story to break before they go out and buy a car, which is the fundamental reason for being for the whole PR and marketing effort, is to sell cars.
Is this race for the journalist to bring stories to market, is it actually a counterproductive process?
Well, I think mainly it's a vanity process. I mean, every journalist wants to be first with the story, okay, and wants to have a different story to every other journalist. But the reality is, from the consumer of that story's perspective, it's largely irrelevant in the car owning, car purchasing, car selling process. And that is the process that the car company, the OEM or the dealer is largely focused on. Is, will this story drive foot traffic? Are we going to see more people coming to our website? Are we going to see more people coming into the showroom to look at this car on the basis of this story? Now, if one story appears 5 minutes before another, that's not really going to make any impact on that. A much more considered and well thought out piece is going to provide more benefit, both to the car company hosting the media and also to the reader who's considering maybe purchasing a new vehicle. So that's why I think that understanding the media, understanding what they want, understanding how you can best shape your message is pretty critical. The other thing is, I think, understanding the media, it implies that you need to understand some of the biases. There are some media who are very biased towards what were traditionally domestic manufacturers. There are some who are biased towards rear-wheel drive vehicles. There are some that were biased towards, V8s. So understanding where your product fits amongst those biases and curating your message, avoid falling into the trap of trying to convince somebody who's a die-hard rear-wheel drive fan that a front-wheel drive car is the best thing since sliced bread, because they're always going to be comparing your front-wheel drive car to a rear-wheel drive car, or vice versa.
And Alexander, within the traditional media space, is there competition or rivalry amongst journalists?
Absolutely. Everybody wants to, as I said, everybody wants to have their own story. There's a publisher that produces 2 car enthusiast magazines, and in most publishing houses, all of the different people who work on the different titles all work in one big room or several big rooms, whereas at this particular publisher, they used to have, locked and secured rooms where they would work on their own individual stories, so that one magazine wouldn't have a clue what the other magazine was going to be producing for its next edition. I think that's changed to a degree now, and there's probably, the economic realities of the market are that there's probably going to be a bit more shared resources. But that where there is competition, there's always better outcome, because everybody is, just as in between the competition between the car companies themselves, you get people pushing hard to dig up a better story and find out more classified information, more scoops, and to a degree that builds the excitement of the stories and the media, the media of the magazine, and makes it more exciting from a reader's perspective. But I think from a general consumer's perspective, that's not particularly relevant.
Alex, with social media, you've seen the whole rise of social media. Now, is there a different sort of story that you should use going out to social media? And is there a difference between what an OEM does compared to what a dealer should do? How does that all fit in from a PR perspective?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the social media environment is a much more reduced and distilled environment, so you need to say more with less. There's a great deal of ease of moving between earned and owned media. So the rise of social media has given the OEMs and dealers the ability to tell their own story in their own words without going through the filter of the media. And that is a critical change, because previously the OEMs and the dealers have only been able to tell their story through advertising. Now the in-house PR is able to tell the story directly. So one of my clients this week has announced a significant upgrade to one of its engine packages, and has been able to not only deliver this news live globally at the exact same moment, but they've been able to run a teaser campaign through social media to ramp up interest in this announcement, which was made on Monday night our time, Monday morning European time. And so you have more bites of the cherry, basically. You've got an unlimited amount of space. You've got a very limited amount of attention span, I think, from your audience. So you have to, again, be very careful with what imagery you're using and what language you're using to get the message across in a very concise manner. But you can come back many, many times from different angles, and it doesn't, the cost is quite low compared to the cost of taking out, say, a full page ad in a newspaper. Plus, if you do it centrally, you can reach out to the entire world through LinkedIn, through Facebook, through Instagram, and you've got consistency of message, you've got clarity of message. Your individual subsidiary markets can tailor that message, but stay within the same sort of visuals. So you've got speed of message to market, you've got consistency of message, and you have an array of different social media types, I guess, to get that message out.
Now, with PR, we talk about the good PR, but then there'll be times when there's a bad story out there, where there's some bad PR happening, whether it be on social media or a journalist latches onto something. How do you manage a bad story, and how do you do like the damage control activities?
Depending on what type of damage or bad story it is, sometimes management inside a company can perceive a slightly negative story to be the end of the world, when really it isn't. In the old days, when it was based around newspaper reports, the PR person could say, yes, but that'll be tomorrow's fish wrappers. Whereas with the advent of the internet and social media, a bad story is up there floating around in the ether for pretty much forever. So responding in a positive manner to a significant event or a significantly bad story is important. But the key elements are obviously to respond in a timely manner, to be honest in the response, to be empathetic, and not only have a strategy for dealing with bad news, but also to wargame it internally. Having a crisis management plan for when really bad things happen is critical for any business, particularly in the automotive industry, where you're providing vehicles into the market which can be involved in all sorts of horrific events that are completely and utterly out of your control, or in some cases maybe they're not out of your control. Maybe there has has been a problem with the vehicle that hasn't been addressed, and that does cause problems. I mean, the Takata airbag experience is a particularly apt one, especially for Australia. And, sometimes the efforts that the manufacturer goes to try to alleviate the problem won't do it in itself. Sometimes they have to lean on government or regulatory bodies to help get that away. But I think that the worst thing that you can do as a corporate or as a business is to try and run away from a bad story. You really have to face it full on, but need to understand again fundamentally what is your response, stick to your response, and try to head off the story becoming something that will just run over the long period, because that can do quite bad damage to your brand's reputation. But if it's just a one-off story that is very much a subjective story, I think that those can be like a boat on a wavy sea. You can just ride that out. But if it's something fundamental or catastrophic, you really do need to address it head on and as quickly as possible.
Like some of the images from years gone by, where there'd be, say, cars on the side of the Western Freeway suffering a thermal incident. The front page of the local or of the city newspaper, I recall being at a brand where that was just shocking, but the brand jumped straight onto it and got that vehicle in and did the root cause analysis as to what happened with that vehicle, and then took action straight away. So would it be fair to say having an action plan, a crisis management plan, is a critical piece?
It is critical, and the disaster plan needs to be, again, as I say, war-gamed on a regular basis, because you could have your 4 or 5 or 6 key executives in the room and go through the motions and become proficient in dealing with these sorts of issues. But people change jobs quite quickly in the auto industry, and if you don't, run these from year to year, you don't identify where the weak links are in the response process. And the response process is really critical. It has to be driven from the very top of the business, and the MD's got in charge of it. But with a lot of businesses, sometimes the MD might be overseas or might be in a different time zone, so there needs to be fallback positions that can accommodate that. And to a degree, the MD is going to be relying on the PR person to direct a lot of that activity. And certainly, either the MD or the PR person is going to be the nominated person to front up the media and talk to them. But the level of direct interaction with the media is always dictated by the level of significance of the issue. When the Volkswagen Dieselgate issue appeared a few years ago, that had to go straight to the CEO of the VW Group, because it was a fundamental business issue for the entire business.
Now, Alex, do you have any specific do's or don'ts that a company must definitely do or definitely don't from a PR perspective? Some advice that you could give our dealers or OEMs? From a crisis management perspective, yes,
your best asset is a representative who can remain calm in a crisis. Now, as I mentioned, that usually could be the managing director, but sometimes you might have a managing director who's a very passionate person, and maybe sometimes having somebody who's a little bit calmer and can retain a degree of clarity of thought under pressure, and that's usually a good person to use, or your public relations person. I think practicing direct and difficult Q&As is also good. That being able to answer difficult questions clearly. You don't always need to go into huge amounts of detail. Making sure that the business speaks with one voice is also very important. So there is only one person talking, and that person is able to convey those details and not allow anybody else within the business, the management group or the business, to be talking to the media. That's very important. To also communicate internally to the business that there is, certainly at a high level, that there is an ongoing crisis, and to make sure that everybody understands that if there are inquiries made by customers, by channel partners, there is a message that is going out, and sometimes you might want to circulate the bones of that message to be conveyed internally only, because maintaining the confidence of your partners, your customers, and your channel partners is absolutely critical through those moments.
In keeping with the US presidential election, the question for me is, where does fake news fit in with PR? Because fake news seems to be, there's a lot of, you talked about social media and the unfiltered nature of the information. Where does fake news fit in with the whole PR story, and how do you manage it?
Well, there are some people out there who would consider that all PR-generated news is fake news. But I think that fake news can be very counterproductive. As I mentioned earlier, I think being authentic in your messaging is absolutely critical. You're creating an image in the mind of the recipient or the consumer of this information that needs to be a legitimate reflection of where your business is and what your business is all about. And I don't see how you can possibly benefit your own brand from delving into the murkiness of fake news. And also from an earned perspective, it's hard enough to get positive messages out than to put effort into spreading fake news. And there are plenty of people out there trolling around on the internet that are willing to dream up rubbish themselves. So from a PR perspective, I think you need to be on the lookout for fake news, obviously, and you need to be monitoring the channels that you control yourselves very carefully, because it's not uncommon for there to be people commenting on your website or on your Facebook site about your brand, spreading all sorts of either malicious or incorrect information, and making sure that is either removed or is countered very, very quickly is critical.
Yeah, Alex, a question for me, because around that's not really fake news, but you sometimes see incidents of someone has a bad experience with a product or tries to make out as if they had a bad experience with a product to get a free lunch or something out of it. How do you deal with that sort of situation? Because it might be a genuine issue or it might not be, and you're not always quite sure.
Well, what I've seen that I think is the most impressive way of dealing with it is to immediately answer that person in that public forum and then ask them to make contact directly through a more private forum where the details can be authenticated. Often in these cases, by the time somebody's ready to go public with it, the relationship with maybe the primary contact has broken down. But you're never sure, there's always two sides to a story. It's very important to work with the channel partners to try to reassure or redress the situation. Being proactive is always, and being proactive in a very timely manner is always the preferable way to go about this. You never want to get to the stage where a customer's setting their vehicle on fire and on live Facebook video, and it should never ever come to that. Even with the most horrific set of circumstances, it's always going to be a better outcome for the OEM or the dealer to try to resolve one issue rather than trying to resolve dozens of issues.
Because we've seen that with a few brands where customers have destroyed their vehicles online to really raise a negative public profile of brands and have been quite brand damaging.
I think, and it can do that sort of damage is very long term. As I said before, those images can stay on the internet forever and they can be searched by anybody who's looking for a new vehicle of that type. That's going to pop up. And nothing, in such a competitive market where there's more than 60 brands, everybody needs to be able to fight in the market without that sort of baggage. In most cases, the cost of resolving the problem is minute compared to the cost of the brand damage. If you forego the sale of 10 or 15 vehicles because one vehicle owner or operators had a really bad experience, that cost is far greater, and especially at a dealer level as well. So I'm not saying that vehicle is always at fault. Operator error is very common in our industry, but there needs to be a sensible way of dealing with these problems as soon as possible. Letting them fester is never going to be good for anybody in the process.
Now, Alex, we spoke earlier a bit about the PR manager and understanding the press and the different representatives from the press. But how do they really go about engaging with them, and what are the things they can do to engage with the press?
Well, there's several different sort of metrics for measuring how well the media or particular journalists, can interact with you. Favourability is a very important one, and familiarity. So I think it really starts with familiarity, understanding what the brand is about, what the products are all about, and then moving on to favourability. And the way that happens is with as much contact as possible. Now, with 60 brands in the market, journalists aren't going to be able to spend all day every week with a particular brand, but providing opportunities for interaction with the product, with management, with visits to overseas facilities, to overseas launches is a really good way of providing that degree of familiarity. If the PR manager is able to structure these interactions in a way that the particular interests of the journalist are fulfilled, then the outcome's always going to be a better story and a greater level of eagerness to re-interact in future times. There are some journalists that are very focused on advanced technology. There are some that are very focused on, driving dynamics. So the ones with the interest in driving dynamics, well, obviously they want to be experiencing the product on the most challenging roads. Those who are interested in advanced technology want to be talking to the guys in charge of R&D, because those people at the cutting edge of any department in those sorts of businesses always have very interesting stories to tell, because the jobs they're doing are very interesting, and then they have a very large remit across the business. So the journalist having an interaction with them is always going to come away with a really good story. And I think that's, the story is the king, and being able to match up the journalist with the element of the story that they're most interested in is going to give you the best result.
So it's not just leveraging the journalist with a nice meal and an overseas trip?
Look, sometimes it can be. It depends on the individual journalist. I think the overseas trip thing, obviously, at the moment is completely off the board. From a Victorian perspective, all of the current the manufacturers based in Victoria, their PR efforts are quite stymied, and it's people who've been handing out vehicles for test have been having difficulties all around the country, because you need to take much longer to prepare the vehicles. So it has been a pretty challenging time, and launching new product also at the moment is very, very difficult, especially if you've got a product that's particularly dynamic, because it's very hard to show off the USPs of this vehicle if you're unable to get people in to drive them.
So Alex, from your perspective, what are the best mediums to use? Is it video? Is it images? Is it text? How do you get that message across? Or is it a combination of all?
Look, it'll be a combination of them all. I think in the modern age, you have to have moving pictures. Even if you're working for a newspaper, the newspaper will have an online presence, and newspapers have become a little bit like television news stations. They want to have moving pictures. They want to have sound bites. So I think that is, that's pretty much a fundamental part of it now. Images, absolutely. The picture does tell 1,000 words, and sometimes if you're catching up on your news through a small handheld device, the image is going to absolutely tell a story. Text is, under pressure. People are time poor. People are used to seeing story in 140 characters or less. So it does sort of lead towards a boiling down of the fundamentals into a very small soundbite or text bite. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing in this era where vehicles are becoming much, much more complex, and the differentiation between the vehicles is getting down to an almost granular level. It's not a case of, well, that one's got a 6-cylinder engine, that one's got a 4-cylinder engine. Now you're talking about generations of technology being, sometimes the determinators of where people decide to go and buy, because one vehicle's got a 2021 era technology system that it's built on, as opposed to one that might have a 2019 generation technology in it. To a degree, it depends on which segment of the market you're playing in as well, what sort of price point and who your audience is. I think if you're in the premium segment now, you have to be talking about sustainability, absolutely, because the early adopters and the wealthier, the AB demographics are now wanting to be seen to be environmentally sensitive. But I think that's going to cascade down through the industry very, very, very quickly.
I think it's interesting, Alexander, talking about the moving pictures are a must now. And that blurring between what were traditional newsprint media organisations now having more video content as obviously they migrated to the digital space, but and the need for images in that storytelling. But yet there's the flip also of people have given us feedback that we need to do more turning our moving picture story into text. For people to read. So it actually flips both ways. It's an amazing space. And that's why I was just keen to get your perspective on it, because there really seems to be a combination where everything's turning into the one homogenised pot almost.
Yes, to a degree. I mean, I think that it depends on what the message is. If you're trying to get across some high-level messages that we have a new gadget that we're selling, the pictures will tell the story much more quickly. And it also depends on how you're receiving the information. For this show, some people might be watching it at their desk on a big screen monitor. Others might be listening to it as a podcast as they, take a walk around the block, having their 1 hour of exercise or 2 hours of exercise. So, and again, if the information that you're putting across is wholly intellectual in nature, then obviously you don't need any imagery for that. If you're trying to sell somebody on the appeal of that beautiful orange Alpha Montreal behind you, then obviously, beautiful big bold pictures really work. And one of the things I think that is really beneficial for the industry is, and certainly for, from the enthusiast perspective, is that in the newspaper in the past, and when I worked on newspapers in Australia, we'd have maybe one picture of a car and it may be printed in monotone, black and white. Whereas now there's no end to the stream of imagery. BMW put out some release earlier this week of the new M3 and M4, which is obviously their pinnacle performance vehicles, and they issued 140 press images. And I actually looked through all of them because obviously I have a bit of a BMW background and I'm a particular fan of M3s, and all of those images were absolute works of art, and they were all beautiful. And I was able to, I'm sure on their website somewhere, they have all of those 140 shots. And so when you're talking about a vehicle or a product that's of interest to a particular segment, then having one picture of it as opposed to having access to 140 images of it is a much more efficient way of telling the whole story about that product and letting somebody who's really enthusiastic about it, or you're creating the desire for that product by showing it off so effectively. Back 10, 15 years ago, 140 images would have been utterly superfluous. Whereas now BMW has taken the view that they can go to the expense and the effort of putting out 140 pictures because they know there are places around the internet where they're going to be, most of those images will be available, and there'll be people there that want to consume them or save them or make them wallpaper or desktop or Zoom image type things. And that's a great way of building brand loyalty, brand interest.
Wow. And that fits in perfectly with the whole idea of earned marketing, where you put those images in the public domain, they're high resolution, people then tell your story for you because you've used that medium to do so. And if they want other information, they can get that from other parts of your publications or your website or other information you've put out there.
And to a degree, I mean, much of the media is aghast at this concept or was aghast at the concept. But every person with a Facebook page, every person with an Instagram presence, every person with a LinkedIn presence has become a journalist to a degree or a publicist to a degree for product. Now, that can be for good or it could be for bad. Largely, it's for good. I mean, I would think that, there would be a lot of people who are, say, fans of Alpha QVs or BMW M3s or whatever, would be adopting those press images into their own personal electronic identities, which is a fantastic way of building up that brand exposure. Harder for the more mainstream generic brands to do, obviously, and they will have to work harder or work more like the enthusiast brands to try to get their build. I think one of the Korean brands has come up with a bespoke motorsport division, which is very effectively, working to build more credibility for their brand, and doing it through they're following pretty much in the wheel tracks of, say, BMW M or Mercedes-AMG, and doing it very effectively as, creating visual heroes for their brand. Not just a car that looks like everything else that's got a more powerful engine, but having something that's got individual colour schemes and flares and bigger wheels, and that, I think that's still a very effective way of getting that message out.
Now, Alexander, influencers have always been a big part of automotive, and traditionally it was sportsmen. You did get some sportsmen to drive your vehicle. Now, we've seen that, so influencers have changed into how many followers you have. How important is it? And do you think it's very important for dealers also to look for influencers in their local community?
I think there's probably a place for what you mentioned, the traditional ambassador for a brand used to be very effective. I think some brands have probably taken that to extremes, and they've had, huge cohorts of ambassadors. Everybody gets a free car. And that sort of concept has degraded, I think, in the minds of the general public that, he's just got a free car. He's not really, he's just a person with a profile says got a free car. I'm not convinced about online influencers entirely, because when you're purchasing a motor vehicle, it is a very significant investment of funds. I'm not sure that somebody who only has a profile famous for being famous, is necessarily going to be influencing you to spend $50,000, $60,000. Again, I'm not sure where these influencers have their audiences either. I think it's quite difficult, certainly down at a dealer level, to make those sorts of decisions on influencers. Maybe at a more corporate level, where you are interacting with agencies that are, fostering these relationships with the influencers, that may be. And maybe if you have a particular product that you're aiming at a particular market, then that might work. One of the things, though, that I think really came out of one of your earlier interviews was that I think you were saying that, or one of your interviews was saying that, more than 50% of the market is people over 50 for new vehicles. I'm not sure that people over 50 who've had a bit of a lived, a life experience, they bought several vehicles, I'm not sure that they're necessarily going to be influenced to spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 on the say-so of somebody that they've never heard of before. More likely to be attracted and influenced by a highly successful sports person, or a person from another walk of life where they have a profile for actually achieving something.
But you might find that if it's a local community, that someone is running a successful business is driving a certain van or using a certain van. Do you think something like that could work as an influencer?
Yeah, I think so. I particularly like commercial vehicles as billboards. I think that can be very, very effective. I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there for dealers to leverage commercial vehicles to promote their own brands themselves, just by how they, where they position them, how they position them. And certainly, with some brands and some activities, a placement could be quite good. If you, for instance, the installer of high-end audio equipment, then lending a high-end branded van to that type of guy, that could have some impact.
And it's interesting that there are actually many dealers that jump on the successful sporting professional bandwagon, whether they be current players or sports people or even past players, to leverage that pull on the emotional string. So dealers that do that, what's the best way to get the most out of that? Because there are mistakes that some businesses do. They give an influencer a product or a service. That influencer gets picked up for drink driving or
driving without a license, for instance.
Exactly. or they underpay their staff, all this sort of stuff, where if you're using a business operator and all this sort of stuff. So how do you manage that, and what's a good way of approaching the plan, if you like, around using an influencer?
Yeah, look, I think you really have to do very, very careful research into the background of this potential person, and to understand how they're going to be using your product, where they're going to be using it, and to set, I think it's very important to set some metrics, some realistic metrics on on, what are you as a dealer going to be getting out of this? I don't think that there's much benefit in just handing over the keys of a car to somebody and saying, off you go. If you can integrate their driving of this vehicle with some other activities that you're, as a dealer, involved in, I think that makes a lot more sense. So maybe it makes sense to lend the coach of the football team that you sponsor one of your vehicles. Maybe it makes sense to loan a vehicle to a celebrity chef type person who's got a restaurant in your PMA, and you have maybe a customer night at a restaurant. Then you're leveraging some synergies, I suppose, to use the business parlance, so that it actually looks like it's an authentic relationship rather than one that's I just desperately need to get some exposure. And I think being able to see where, be able to measure the response that you're getting, making sure this person is being seen in the vehicle at the right place is very important. I know some dealers who have been involved with things like cycling teams, providing them maybe with a van to move the bikes around, and that's I think that's quite effective ways of doing it, because usually the guys in those cycling teams are in business themselves, and it's a good way of connecting with people who are able to make a company car purchase of their own choice, and that is a way of sort of getting into the minds of people who can make a decision on buying a car that's more discretionary rather than just business based.
Just on that topic as well, could I ask you about, with influencers, car modders and people that actually make changes to the vehicles or build new cars out of the vehicles, and how brands interact with them? I think there's famously brands being quite conservative. I think famously Ferrari, not liking people uploading videos and pictures of engine swapped cars and stuff like that. What's your opinion on that and that side of things?
Yeah, I think corporates are very conservative because they have to remain within a very tight band of legislative arrangements in terms of performance and emissions, and also liability, warranty. Pretty much a standard warranty says that if you change anything on the car, it's no longer warranted by the manufacturer, and that does destroy a degree of value for the owner. Makes it more difficult to sell on. In the Australian environment, you might have to, have things re-complianced, which is expensive and difficult to do. So I think that manufacturers are very concerned about their reputations, very concerned that they don't see their product being used in a manner to which it hasn't been, developed or engineered. They're also very worried about people's safety, and especially in the current era where there's so much electronic control over every element of how the vehicle works, so much electronics involved in the safety systems, and no manufacturer wants to see not in use footage of cars right around trees that have been interfered with. So I think that generally speaking, manufacturers are very, very wary of modifications. A few manufacturers in Australia have toyed with third-party vehicle improvers. Nissan most recently with their Navara, which they have had a special edition put together. And but that's been with an agency that they have very high degrees of confidence in their engineering abilities. Ford also came up with a spec for Mustang locally that was quite good. But again, these are tried and tested modifications. And no manufacturer wants to really be involved with somebody who's just going to bolt a turbocharger onto a car that wasn't designed for it, that doesn't have the cooling or the systems in place to cope with that.
So while there might be potential benefit towards the PR story of getting your car out there, the risks far outweigh it most of the time.
I don't see any car company PRs being keen to promote third-party modifications that haven't been examined and tested and approved. I think it's very rare that you see that. You do tend to see that more in Europe, but again, the regulatory environment might be different there. The UK had a really, really long history of people modifying vehicles. Certainly in the 60s, dumping crate V8s from the the States into British-designed cars, and that was very successful. And in fact, one of the most successful ones might have been the Sunbeam Alpine, turning it into the Sunbeam Tiger. Putting a Ford V8 into it, and that car was actually manufactured again by a third party in the UK. But I think in the current environment, where emissions regulations are so tight and safety regulations are so tight, it's really too hard for a subsidiary operation in Australia to give its to get corporate blessing on modifications.
And the last part of that is just not just the corporate side encouraging modifications or sponsoring an influencer kind of thing, but also around the companies ordering cease and desists on videos of car modifications and stuff like that they don't actually sponsor in any way. Just, it's a video of someone bolting a turbocharger onto the car. Sometimes brands really don't like to have those images out there, is I think the perception.
Yeah, I mean, that's a more difficult situation. I think that's usually driven by more, I suppose, legal issues rather than PR issues.
Sorry, that's my, as someone who's never worked in the industry, that was the point of interest for me. That's my one dumb question.
Yeah, no, I think that, the OEMs are very, very protective of their IP, and, they do spend millions of dollars literally building their brands and building the messaging around their products and what the product can do. I think it's reasonable for, the reasonable test would be that, somebody seeing a video of a car with 3 turbos on it would see that it's not an official product of that company. But sometimes, I guess, OEMs get very protective of that sort of stuff. In some cases, OEMs get excited by third-party repair shops putting their brand on the front of their business. There are regulatory and legal limits sort of outlining what is and isn't possible. And, sometimes, brands want to defend more strongly than maybe they're allowed to.
Yeah, I think the assumption made going into that question was that brands issue these cease and desists because they're worried about their image, and it's a pure PR point.
Ky, it's actually bigger than that. There's a whole raft of reasons why brands won't do that. And Alexander's covering that off quite extensively about, the brand story. Brand is becoming more and more a critical piece of protection, because that's the only thing that differentiates you from another vehicle that has steel, rubber and plastic. So it's all about the brand and the compliance that each brand has to have a product that meets all of those complex design rules that each country has, emission rules and liability rules. So a brand, and I've as a mechanic years ago, we used to hot rod cars and etc. I used to go to trade school and used to sit there in front of my trade school teacher and say, why don't we just put multi-carburetors on every car? That's just crazy. Why don't they just do that? This is pre-carburetor day, pre-fuel injection days. Or let's put superchargers on everything. But what it comes down to is the car company, and then having worked for a number of OEMs, the time it takes to engineer and the amount of people who get paid a lot of money, who are very smart, look at all the implications of what does that extra carburetor do? A, how much does it cost? B, what's the net output? What does the market want to see from a fuel consumption perspective? So each car is a compromise in some way, shape or form. And when someone like me would come along and whack on twin side draft Webers on a Celica 1600 without regard for the correct calibration of the emulsion tubes and the like, it would go very well, but I would throw heaps of CO2 out the back, probably some unburned fuel as well. And I'd be compromising the braking system because it was calibrated to have a single carburetor on it. So I'm actually putting other road users in danger. So brands will only validate what their engineering departments and their product teams have put together. And that's why it's so important for them to have that one voice that Alexander talks about in this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and here's a product that I can stand here and I can stand in a court of law and say that is the product that I am happy to have on the road, because the road users aren't in danger within the parameters that I've designed it in, and I want people to maintain it. So whenever a car goes in for service, the whole idea is the vehicle is returned back to standard. When a car is running out of spec, when it gets repaired, it's returned back to standard. So you don't want to be hot rodding cars or validating someone who bolts on something that you haven't tested, because that person, should that behaviour create a fad and you're seen to support it, when something goes bad, the first person that gets dragged into the courts are you, the manufacturer, because you've been seen, whether it be express or implied, that you've supported that activity. And that's why it's the likes of Alexander and their PR teams and the legal teams and after-sales teams in the OEMs and even dealerships to bring it back to this car is standard. There may be a bit of a fun story that the aftermarket can talk about. That's great. But if you're an OEM, it's protecting your brand and protecting everything that you've engineered.
And I think the misconception that people have is that key. It's the protecting your brand. A lot of people, I specifically hear that as a member of the general public and think that's a brand being precious, but it's not.
It is absolutely being precious. You got to be precious. A cricketer wants to protect their image if they're seen as a good straight bat player, and then having photos of them in a nightclub somewhere is not good for their brand.
Or having sandpaper in their hand.
Correct. No, or the underarm bowling delivery. No, we don't talk about that either.
There are many ways to win.
A question for me, where do you see the future of PR and where do you think it's going to go to?
Well, I still think it's a very exciting future if the brand is able to plug into the excitement and the experience that it can offer. And I see a lot more smaller, more focused, experiential type activities happening now. I mean, again, 15, 20 years ago, there may have been there'd be 20 tier 1 journalists that you'd need to host. Now the numbers have exploded. So you can be a bit more focused on what you're going to be doing. I think certainly from down at a more dealer customer level, again, experiential activities so that you can show off the unique features of the brand or the products will probably come to the fore to create a closer relationship with potential customers. Another element that's particularly critical is that the dynamic performance of motor vehicles has increased substantially in the last few years, partly thanks to advances in tyre technology and suspension technology, but also partly or majorly due to electronics and electronic vehicle controls. So, and engines are becoming a lot more powerful and a lot more efficient. So it's very difficult to experience the vehicle's full potential on a public road. And I would see that in the future there'll be a lot more closed road or track-based activities to show off the prowess of the vehicle. And, there's an argument that says, within the Australian environment where top speed is largely 110 in the vast majority of the public roads, a vehicle that can do in excess of 250 kilometres an hour is irrelevant. And you pay a lot of money for a car that can do 250 k's an hour, but you can never legally exploit that. That's not to say that people don't over a short spurt occasionally. But really, to be able to demonstrate the prowess of the vehicle, you do need a track. And I think that we will see later on more of these sorts of activities where you can get a bit more out of the vehicle. And I've seen many customer track days where you can build your brand up significantly by exploiting some of these usually hidden abilities of the vehicle, and people become very much welded to their car or their brand through that activity. Certainly the days of, chasing other journalists down back roads at ridiculous speeds is over, because I don't think from a corporate responsibility perspective, OEMs or subsidiary marketing companies are willing to take those risks these days. And as I say, the cars are so much more powerful. If you look at the relative output of a mainstream car 20 years ago, if you were getting 80 kilowatts, 80 or 90 kilowatts, you were doing really well. Now it's 130, 140 kilowatts. Cars have got heavier, that's true, but, acceleration rates are much faster than they ever were before. You can get yourself into trouble really, really quickly. And no OEM wants to be hosting an event where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
So, Alexander, a question for me, just read the future. And and you're talking about the track days and the speed, etc. Is that where the customers or the people who are the target audience that you want to reach, is there a disconnect? I'm thinking a lot from a future perspective. Are we going down a road with PR that doesn't line up with what customers want? Like if there's a big environmental story to tell, doing track days and the like, is that connecting, or is the industry going down one way and maybe missing an opportunity with customers the other way?
Well, if you wanted to take some of the pessimistic viewpoint, you'd say that the rise of electrification and automation means that the whole love affair with the car will be over, and that you may not even own a car in the future. You may just buy the service or the mobility service of a vehicle almost pick randomly from your phone. A bit like now where you might use Uber to get around and you don't care what car turns up to pick you up. You just want to be transported from A to B, from home to office or home to the airport or whatever, a bit like a generic taxi service. And, that is a big risk for, I think, the manufacturing industry, is that if the differentiation process by the customer is removed, then you're going to lose a lot of that PR effort, because if people aren't choosing a vehicle because of any personal preference for how it drives or how it looks, that's going to make it very difficult to justify why would you buy an Alpha rather than a Hyundai, for instance, because individual people won't be buying them. They'll just be bought by corporations, or maybe even the car companies themselves will be operating them as a service. That's going to make PR very, very difficult. I think as we've reached the stage now where we're probably at a stage of peak car, where it's really, really difficult to find a car that's bad, and therefore pretty much any product on the market will do the task of taking you from home to the shops, or from home to school, or from home to the office, which is where the vast majority of operating environment, that is the vast majority of operating environments. And therefore, maybe the differentiators aren't power and performance, but maybe they are their level of technical advancement. And, are you able to bring your office into the car and do all the things that you can do on your laptop or you can do on your phone now in the car? And again, that's going to make it very difficult from a PR perspective, because we won't be automotive PR people anymore. We'll be electronics PR people. And again, we might just be divided into Microsoft PC versus Mac in terms of the systems that are used in the cars. And I think that's a big danger, because once you get to the stage where all vehicles are automated, the point of difference between them will be almost irrelevant.
I like what you just said. Then the word. And 10 years ago, in fact, 12 years ago, we were talking about peak oil, peak car. I've not heard that before. I've actually wondered that. I've wondered that myself, whether a million new cars in Australia is actually peak car, and 2017 may have been the peak year for new car sales in Australia, and now we're getting down to less ownership and more usership, which we've covered in some other podcasts.
But also, I think that the experience of 2020, where working from home has not been a disaster for a lot of people. I mean, it probably has been for some. But I know that I own and register and insure 6 cars in my household, and I'm very unhappy because I've paid out about 10 grand in licensing and insurance for vehicles that haven't turned a wheel for months. So when you work from home, or if you think that you'll be working from home a lot more in the future, then you're taking out of the equation maybe 50 to 60% of the mileage that you would do annually. And then, you might decide, well, do I really need to own a car? And if I don't need to own a car, maybe for the 2 weeks of school holidays when I want to take the kids out somewhere, I can go and rent a car, and I could probably go and rent a nice car or a fun car for that time. And I don't have to pay rego, I don't have to pay insurance, I don't have that huge depreciation to cover. And most importantly, or perhaps most importantly, I've got a whole new space in my house that I could use for something else. I could put a billiard table in the garage, or I could put one of those nice car driving game console things in there with a seat and steering wheel. So I think we have reached peak car. I think those the days of having a car sitting outside your house all day doing nothing, people are going to start looking at that and start counting up the cost and thinking, do I really want to do this? And with the availability of Uber-type services, where it's so easy and convenient and relatively safe. I've got two kids who are drivers, and their interest in cars was very, very, very small compared to my interest 35 years ago, 40 years ago when I was getting my license. I can wait. Well, this generation, they understand that they can't drink and drive. They understand that, if they go out as a group, somebody's going to have to be the nominated driver. And they'd much rather just hop in an Uber. They don't have to worry about parking. They don't have to pay for parking.
Alexander, thanks very much. I think there's been a really interesting discussion today. So I think it's a fascinating topic. And I think there's such potential and opportunity. But as you say, it's going to change over time. So thanks very much for sharing your experience and your knowledge. It's been very eye-opening to me. And
it's my pleasure, and I very much enjoyed it.
Now, Alexander, what we do with each show, I think you've seen a few of them now. I'm a massive fan of Arndo. And Arndo, when he does his artwork, and he captures the individual that he's been interviewing, and he comes up with this magnificent masterpiece, which I am so in awe of what he does. So I try to do that and try to do it justice by summarising what you've just covered off in a summary. Just whilst you're talking away there, I'm feverishly writing down with my pencil, which is a really cool one, which I got from my days at Renault, it's a Palomino, which is a nickname I used to have at General Motors, and it's a Blackwing Hawk. So it's a Blackwing Pearl, yes. Palomino. So very nice pencil. So free advertising for those that like a really nice pencil with an eraser on the top. But I've taken some notes, and I'm keen to summarise this, John, if I could, unless you want to do it today.
No, Mark, I'd hate to get in your way. You do it superbly. So
Alexander, let's see if I can get this right. And thank you once again for joining us. And I share John's appreciation of what you've covered, because I've taken a mountain of notes here, and I want to do it justice as a summary. It used to be 3 things, but it's way more than 3. So when we look at PR is very much about taking the audience on a journey. And you can leverage things such as heritage, technology, telling a story of what's new, and there has to be a hook to get people on board. But you have to do it in a way that's authentic and real, so that your target audience absorbs what you're saying. Now, you do it through creative and through a message that conveys excitement. And you have to get that desire in there and be distinctive, a bit of distinctive by design. So then when we look at the process, it has to be a process with an end goal of brand. And this is something we talked with Ky about, protecting the brand, building the brand, but also protecting it. And you want to tell the story of what is your product or service that you're providing. You need to know what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And that comes into the strategy, what makes a good PR strategy. And you engage with journalists and you work out which way you want to approach it. Is it a presentation? Is it a dinner? Or is it some form of stunt that makes it even more memorable? And that can be a very effective way to really get some energy. But you've also got to be aware of the biases of each of the journalists that you're engaging with, or the media that you're engaging with. And you need to know what resources are at your disposal to leverage and what budget you've got. And then when you look at social media, the beauty of social media is it tells a story without that media filter. So you're going directly to your audience without the filter of the journalists or the editors, which can be a good and bad thing, which is why you are ultimately in control of that storytelling. Now, then we talked about bad PR, when bad things happen. And the key there is to have a plan, have a crisis management plan that you war game regularly. So it's a bit like a training drill as to what happens if this goes on. And you've got to respond quickly, honestly, and with empathy. So no point saying, yes, we did it, and we're telling, yes, we did it, but we don't care about the results. You really got to show empathy for the audience and the customers. And then you've got to be calm when you're delivering it, and you've got to deliver it as one voice. You can't have any dissenting operatives in your organisation that undermine your story. You then, as far as engaging the press, you've got to profile who they are and what hits the hot button for each one of these individuals. And also, there's the understanding that it's actually hard to engage with them right now in the COVID environment because you can't do new model launches, etc. So you've got to look at ways to do that effectively and bide your time or look at another medium. And then you look at as far as what sort of media to use. The modern story has to be moving pictures. So video is a critical piece, but also have a lot of high-res images that you want to get out into the marketplace so that your customers tell your story. So the more storytellers out there, the better it is. Back it up with some text as far as from a digital perspective that there can be further enhancements, but it's really the moving picture and then the images that flow. So from a hierarchy, that's the ideal, but you still need to have a combination of all three. And then when we look at influencers, you've got to be very careful who you select and make sure there are parameters around what those influencers will do for you and how they conduct themselves with your product or service or brand. Because you don't want to then have to go into the war game situation to go to damage control about an influencer that you've paid money for. So, and there's very much about setting objectives as to what you want from all parties with the arrangement. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating. And there's a lot that whether you're a small business, large business, can take from that structure and understanding all of those key elements, because it is actually quite a complex place, but not that complex that it's that scary. And it really is a cost-effective way of getting a message out. Have I missed anything?
No, that was a very good summary. I think one of that last element that you mentioned about the cost effectiveness of it. A lot of maybe tier 2 businesses that don't do enough PR work because they don't know how to do it, or they don't know how to. They're not sure about getting involved with the media. But there's a lot of good stories out there that need to be told, that should be told. That just aren't getting told because I think maybe there's no understanding of how the system works or how to prepare, how to build the strategy, which is a shame. But that's the job of the contracted PR person, is to get out there and tell them that their story needs to be told.
And if anyone has any need for further information, they can reach out to yourself.
And of course, yeah.
So, or reach out to John or myself, and we can steer them in your direction.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anything else, Mark, from your side?
No, all done from me. Alexander, thank you.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I've got two pages of notes here. I'll put them up to the screen. Not sure you can see them. I might disappear as well. They're here anyway. There's 2 pages. There you go.
Wow. Okay.
So no, that was very impressive, and thank you.
Thanks.
See ya. Bye.
Well, thank you very much for listening today. We have enjoyed bringing the podcast to you. If you liked what you heard, please click the bell below and follow us on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to our show on YouTube, and we'll bring you notifications every week of the latest edition. If you want to get more involved in sponsorship or inquiring about some of the services we provide, please reach out to Mark Pellavestra or myself, Ky Sinclair, on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for joining us today.